All wars are civil wars because all of humanity are essentially brothers and sisters. This is the basic fact of evolution over millions of years. But there is always a problem. Sibling Russia claiming a right to control the territory of Ukraine could not realize this fact, and thousands of people died for nothing. The soldiers who died from both sides on the territory of Ukraine actually saw the end of this war because only the dead see the end of the war. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, continue to struggle by revealing their military power and self-data in all cities from Donetsk to Luhansk, from Melitopol to Kherson, in order to see the end of this war before they die and to regain the independence of their country. So what stage is the war currently in, and what breakthroughs have the Ukrainians planned to end this war? The clearest answer to these questions is hidden in Donbass, which is formed by the hard steppe soils of Ukraine. The failures of Russia come to the fore even more as the Ukrainian armed forces makes maximum use of its military power and tends to take more strategic steps. The biggest example of this issue is experienced in Donbass, as we mentioned, especially in the Donetsk region. Russia is going through very painful phases and has to deal with major problems in terms of military ammunition. You know that the city of Bakhmut almost swallowed half of the military equipment of the Russian armed forces. In addition, the Russians are becoming more and more trapped in this region as Ukrainian forces have recently begun to collect data on their arsenals and other military equipment in the Donetsk region with their drones. While Ukraine's reconnaissance and detection UAVs continued their missions, Russian arsenals in the Donetsk region became the clear target of Ukraine once again. The fact that the drones of the Ukrainian army shares the location of the Russian arsenals in Donetsk with the Ukrainian artillery units located in this region causes fierce clashes and increased Russian losses. So where do the Ukrainians carry out these critical operations and how do they get such effective results? In fact, in order to find out, we have to move to the city of Bakhmut, which is located in the Donetsk region, because, first of all, we need to tell you about the underground war centers in the city. They created battle centers in the underground parts of some strategic areas of the 41-kilometer battlefield. In these war centers, the most skilled drone operators of the Ukrainian army are constantly operating. Ukrainian drone operators provide their artillery units with the coordinates of the location of the most important Russian arsenals in these underground war centers. In this way, the Ukrainian artillery units manage to destroy the Russian arsenals with point shooting without any difficulty. Thanks to this striking war strategy, Ukrainian forces blew up a total of 14 Russian arsenals in the Donetsk region in the last week. In addition to the Ukrainian artillery units, it was claimed that some Ukrainian elite units in this region carried out direct hits with the death ray gun called the Death Ray, and therefore the Russians lost too much arsenal. Yes, in the last week, the casualties taken by the Russians seemed to be a bit too much. This place where the most Russian casualties occurred in the Donetsk region was the city of Bakhmut. As you all guessed, the Ukrainian armed forces destroyed the Russian arsenals, mostly in Bakhmut, Mariupol and Melitopol regions, 1 in Mariupol, 3 in Melitopol and 4 in Luhansk. Russian arsenals were blown up. It was among the latest data that 6 of the 14 Russian arsenals blown up by the key Ukrainian forces of the Russian army were in Bakhmut. It has been reported that these Russian arsenals in Bakhmut were destroyed as a result of 13 striking attacks carried out by the Ukrainian forces in this city the previous day. Again, we turned around and went back to the fortress of war. Bakhmut is almost like a modern Stalingrad that decided the Ukrainian war like Stalingrad 80 years ago. The Battle of Bakhmut may ultimately determine the winner of the war. The site of the Battle of Stalingrad is known today as Volgograd. Volgograd was an astonishing battleground at the time, with its resources and enormous numbers of warships. Likewise, the city of Bakhmut can host thousands of soldiers, and this area can sometimes be too narrow for clashes for both sides of the war. In fact, the city alone does not represent anything more or less important than other cities captured or lost during the war, such as Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Mariupol, Kherson, or more recently, Solder. Yet, for reasons entirely self-explanatory, both Zelensky and Putin attached great importance to Bakhmut. As a result, Russia was willing to suffer enormous losses to capture the city, and Ukraine continued to rain down a steady stream of reinforcements to defend the city. While the scale of the conflicts is not the same, the concepts behind today's Battle of Bakhmut in the 1942–43 Battle of Stalingrad have some notable similarities and some important differences. Just as the advantage side in Stalingrad signaled the winner of World War II, the side that successfully survived this battle could have similar consequences for today's winner. So with all eyes on the fate of the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk, the battle for Bakhmut continued to dominate the news outside of Ukraine this week. The leader of Russia's mercenaries fighting in Bakhmut announced in a statement that his private military company, Wagner Group, has taken full control of the eastern part of the city. But these claims have not been confirmed yet. Following these statements, it recently released a military update in which it stated that Ukraine repelled more than 100 attacks against the Donetsk region, including Bakhmut. This update also included the information that Russian forces continued unsuccessful offensive operations in the region. Also, according to this latest update, the village of Russiaukraineconflict, just 5 kilometers from Bakhmut, was one of the last towns around the city still controlled by Ukraine. Therefore, Russiaukraineconflict became a hub for supply and movement of troops. But in recent days, the city has been subjected to various attacks by Russian artillery. After the Russians turned to the city, the Ukrainian armed forces announced that they carried out a series of missile attacks on different regions of the Donetsk region, where the Russian troops are high. This time it was Ukraine's turn to carry out retaliatory attacks. After these striking attacks, the Ukrainian armed forces reported that it shot down a Russian drone, destroyed a Bakhmut anti-aircraft missile system and 3 Russian warehouses storing fuel and military supplies. After inflicting heavy casualties on the Russians, Ukrainian forces continued to target Russian military resources in Bakhmut again. The clashes in the city would never end, and the sounds of missiles, guns, and bombardments would not cease. The latest shared defensive analysis showed that Russian forces surrounded most of the city and were advancing towards Bakhmut, but did not control all parts of the city, with Ukraine's supply routes to Bakhmut increasingly limited and at risk. Thousands of people still live in the city, most of whom live in dilapidated houses. A Ukrainian unit commander in Bakhmut described the situation on the outskirts of the city as hell, adding that the Ukrainian army is still conducting a limited operation there despite all these negatives. In addition, the fact that the mercenaries of the Wagner Group fought for the Ukrainian army together with the Russian soldiers in the city was one of the most important factors limiting the operations. In other words, the Ukrainian army is trying to fight against both Russian Wagner and even Kadyrov troops here, especially in the past day. We see that the soldiers of the Wagner Group have become quite active near Bakhmut. However, although the Ukrainian forces fought against 3 different fronts, they managed to deal a heavy blow to the mercenaries of the Wagner Group who wanted to become more active around Bakhmut. A number of Wagner Group soldiers were attacked outside Bakhmut by Ukrainian forces as a small Russian mercenary unit was advancing through a rough terrain around Bakhmut. They were targeted by incoming Ukrainian artillery and the mercenary group's positions were destroyed. It turned out that at least a few of the Wagner Group's mercenaries may be within the blast radius. The operation was carried out by the Ukrainian National Guard and the 14th Chervona Kalina Brigade. This brigade was previously garrisoned in the town of Kalinivka in western Ukraine's Vinnytsia Oblast and was expanded last January and reorganized as the 14th Operational Brigade under the Ukrainian Assault Guards program. Also, Oleksandr Okremenko is the current commander of the unit. The slogan of this brigade was "For the enemy where the snowball turns red." Can Russian submarines, considered the crown jewel of naval combat power, still be considered a threat? Russia's navy, which it considers to be one of the biggest trump cards in its hands, is also in danger of losing its value due to the effect of long and exhausting war. As the world got used to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, as stated by then Defense Minister Pavel Grachev, Russia inherited nothing but ruin and rubble. Although Russia still maintains its title as the third largest navy in the world, the Russian Navy has undergone a significant transformation that has profoundly affected its capabilities. Let's take a look at the dangerous transformations of submarines in the Russian Navy. The Russian Navy, once one of the most prestigious and feared in the world, has come a little closer to rust and disintegration. It has long been a topic of discussion that Dmitry Donskoy, the world's largest nuclear submarine in terms of displacement, will be withdrawn from active duty and removed from the Kremlin warship lists. There had been speculation for months about the fate of the submarine. The NATO reporting named Typhoon, which was launched in 1980. The biggest factor in the increase of these speculations was the Russian official media. In 2022, Moscow official media reported that Russia was considering decommissioning its massive Typhoon-class submarine, a ship carrying intercontinental ballistic missiles designed to give Moscow the ability to launch undetectable strikes with nuclear device-tipped missiles on targets around the world. Although the Russian front remained silent for a long time, it could not resist the whispers on the agenda being replaced by loud shouts. The Russian Navy has confirmed that it has decommissioned a nuclear-powered strategic submarine, Dmitry Donskoy, which forms part of Moscow's formidable Cold War weapons system. The submarine has been the only remaining example of the iconic Typhoon class in service for years. Entering service in the 1980s, Dmitry Donskoy was the first of 6 Akula-class Northern Fleet submarines to be landed at the Sevmash shipyard in Severodvinsk. Dmitry Donskoy was equipped with the Bulava missile in 2002. Also, the 574-foot-long Dmitry Donskoy status as the world's largest submarine was surpassed by the 608-foot-long Belgorod nuclear submarine, which entered service in July 2022. While the ship was reported to have been halted in July 2022, no official confirmation was expected until the end of the year. The ship's last reported activity was at the SSN Krasnoyarsk Sea Trials in September 2022. On the other hand, the head of the Russian Naval Support Movement, Vladimir Maltsev, stated that the ship has been decommissioned and that he expects this project to be used at a naval base in Severodvinsk, together with the other 2 units, Arkhangelsk and Severstal Rot there by the Key. These 2 ships have been linked for nearly 10 years. The plan and schedule for the eventual destruction of all 3 boats remains unclear, a process made more complex by the need to safely dispose of the 190-megawatt OX 650 nuclear reactor pair on each. The fate of Dmitry Donskoy, of course, is of great interest given the last Typhoon status of the boat on active duty. The Soviet Union commissioned just 6 of these monstrous nuclear ballistic missile submarines between 1981 and 1989. The collapse of the Soviet Union stopped work on a 7th boat, and the partially built submarine was eventually scrapped. The 6 Typhoons completed, including Dmitry Donskoy, had largely uneventful careers during the Cold War. In 1991, Arkhangelsk, then known only by its hull number TK-17, nearly sank after it suffered a harrowing accident during a planned test launch of an unarmed R-39. Also, the collapse of the Soviet Union, coupled with arms control agreements with the United States, saw the Typhoon fleet shrink steadily after 1991. 3 of the 6 submarines were withdrawn. As already mentioned, Arkhangelsk and Sevastopol have been out of service for years and await a similar fate. Dmitry Donskoy himself has long been entrusted with research and development, testing and evaluation and training activities. It had been modified in several unique ways to support this work, including allowing it to fire the new RSM-56 Bulava nuclear submarine-launched ballistic missiles to aid in the development of the weapon. The submarine was particularly featured in the Navy Day celebrations in St. Petersburg in 2017. In 2021, Dmitry Donskoy's future as an ICH testing and training platform looked bright, with reported plans to keep it in service in these roles until at least 2026. As recently as June 2022, it was still conducting such studies. In the meantime, it's hard to say exactly what might have happened, but Russia is currently under crippling international sanctions as a result of its nearly year-long war in Ukraine. The Russian army lost a significant amount of material during the conflict, which would have to be somehow recapitalized. It is not hard to see how this might have questioned the value of continuing to operate and maintain a single instance of an already very costly and complex submarine. Even before Russia launched its all-out invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the country's government had shown its willingness to delay or even cancel major military projects in order to reallocate funds to higher priority efforts. Russia, on the other hand, has recently had problems with another ship, the 100-foot flagship Admiral Kuznetsov, which is reportedly unable to move under its own power. Russia's only aircraft carrier destroyed. Let's explore this question a little bit. Russia's only aircraft carrier has been plagued by a series of fires, accidents, and corruption in its lifetime. The ongoing overhaul of the Navy flagship first began in 2017. However, it was stopped due to a series of unfortunate events that delayed the ship's return to service. Just weeks after a small fire on the ship in December, Ukraine's defense ministry revealed that Admiral Kuznetsov was unable to act on his own strength. Also, the losses suffered by the Russian Navy are reminiscent of another humiliating defeat 117 years ago. The Russians lost at least 5 Raptor-class patrol boats, a Tapir-class landing craft, a Serna-class landing craft, and most importantly, the Slava-class guided missile cruiser Moskva, which was also the flagship of the Black Sea. The losses themselves are not disastrous for the Russian Navy and are unlikely to change the course of the war or the balance of power in the Black Sea. But these are blows to Russian prestige and come a little over a century after another historic rout for Russia, after the Battle of Tsushima, in which a Russian Navy flagship was sunk in combat. Ukraine's attack on Moskva reinforced Russia's historical defeat. Ukraine prevented the Black Sea Fleet by reliving its historical defeat to Russia. Could this change the tide of the war? We would be glad if you let us know your thoughts in the comments. Russia's Black Sea Fleet was once seen as central to Vladimir Putin's attempt to conquer Ukraine. But that fleet and its accompanying air wing have been battered by Ukraine's innovative missile and drone strikes. And the once feared force has become an afterthought in Europe's greatest war in 7 decades. When Putin launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine in February, the Crimean-based fleet was at the center of the operation, launching caliber cruise missiles at military and civilian targets deep in the country, blocking access to the country's ports and posing a threat. However, since those early days, Kiev has taken the initiative as missile strikes and mysterious explosions have ravaged. The Russian fleet sank several ships, including the flagship cruiser Moskva, and devastated the Crimea-based air wing in a dramatic attack. While the Black Sea Fleet was strong enough to keep the small Ukrainian Navy at bay, it was never a source of pride for the Russian Navy. While Russian submarines occasionally opened fire on Ukraine, the fleet did not meet the expectations set at the start of the war and settled into a situation that meant defensive, crouching in port or on the open sea to avoid a Ukrainian attack. Since the spring, the problems of the Black Sea Fleet have increased as a result of poor leadership, aging equipment, and an arrogance that the Ukrainians are more than happy to exploit. After all these developments, it is difficult to say that the Russian submarines, which are considered the crown of naval combat power, will be considered a threat. But it's not impossible either, because wars by their nature are not suitable for making precise predictions. We will see more clearly the role and power of the submarines, which are the crown jewels of the Russian Navy in the Ukrainian war. The Ukrainians have completely retaken the initiative and conducted a massive counterattack, pushing the Russians so far behind that they essentially lost the whole month of progress. The Russians tried to return these territories back, but as an exclusive footage revealed, the demoralized soldiers made so many mistakes that almost everyone ended up dead. Last time I told you that the Russians slowly lost the initiative after a series of absolutely suicidal assaults. The Russians could no longer keep up the same intensity of their attacks, which quickly led to the loss of their tactical bridgehead. To the east and west of older Russian command decided to take a pause and switch to artillery fire. Simultaneously, a lot of reports started coming in from the Russian side, where Russian commanders basically said that Volodar must be leveled with the ground or the town will not be taken in order to achieve this goal. They started using not only regular artillery and aviation, but also thermobaric artillery. This turned out to be not a very good solution for the Ukrainians because just sitting under artillery fire would mean slowly incurring losses and letting the Russians destroy their defenses. That is why the Ukrainians developed a new plan. First of all, the Ukrainians relocated an additional artillery brigade towards Volodar in order to boost their counter battery efforts. This very quickly brought results as footage appeared of a destroyed Russian thermobaric artillery system. Thus, one is extremely vulnerable to counter battery fire because its range is only around 4 kilometers. This means that they need to get really close to Volodar and expose themselves. The second part of the Ukrainian plan was to develop their counterattack further and preferably chase the Russians from the northern bank of the river. This helps the Ukrainians to achieve two things. Firstly, they are pushing Russian thermobaric artillery away from Volodar itself, and secondly, they are forcing the Russians to disperse their artillery fire by holding many more positions in the region where they threaten Russian forces in order to carry out this counterattack. The Ukrainians reinforced Volodar with multiple assault units from some of the most capable brigades in Ukraine and gave them several tanks. As a result, Russian forces got completely decimated and lost not only the approach to the eastern hamlet, but also the whole residential area and the hills between Volodar and Mogilevsky. And this is how it happened. The Ukrainians took advantage of the increased density of Ukrainian artillery in the region and conducted an extensive but very concentrated artillery preparation. Then they launched into the battle several tanks that broke through the enemy defense and cleared the way for the assault units behind and pushed the Russians all the way back to the residential area near the river. After that, the process was repeated and the Russians had to retreat to the eastern part of this residential area. The next day, the Russians attempted to conduct a counterattack, but judging by the released footage of this battle, the Ukrainians were waiting for it. The Russians tried to use the same tactic and assaulted the Ukrainians with tanks, but due to concentrated artillery fire, they were quickly destroyed and everything went sideways. Some assault units stepped back while others continued to carry out the mission. Those who continued the mission found themselves in an extremely difficult situation because they acted with no cover from other groups and also without artillery support. The Russians sustained very heavy losses in killed and wounded, and this losses increased even more when they tried to save their wounded. Very often, for each wounded, they have 2 or 3 people trying to save him and all of them ended up dead. Many Russian analysts once again shared a devastating critique of the Russian command after witnessing what happened. If the lack of cover from the second group can be explained by the fact that some units retreated after the tanks got immediately destroyed and showed very poor morale of Russian soldiers, then the lack of artillery cover only shows a lack of competence and organization. Overall, the Ukrainians conducted a massively successful counterattack and secured the northern bank of the river. This achievement renders all Russian efforts useless and resets their progress to zero. By controlling this territory, the Ukrainians are not only preventing the Russians from moving anywhere near Volodya, But they also pushed Russian thermobaric artillery away from the main defenses in Volodar and coal mines and are also dispersing Russian artillery fire, which, judging by the footage, is not working properly anyways.